Hello, I'm Polly Boyd, and I've been asked to give a short talk on the history of Oxfam, as my grandfather, Canon Milford, was one of its founders and first chairman. I'll be focusing particularly on the early days, but will also mention briefly how and when Oxfam expanded from its small beginnings to become the world-renowned global organisation that it is today. My talk will take us up to the Oxfam's 50th anniversary in 1992, and then I'll play a 10-minute video of an interview with Dick Milford talking about how Oxfam started and evolved and his personal vision and hopes for the future. To understand why Oxfam was set up, we need to go back to the Second World War, when Greece was invaded and occupied by the Axis powers, Germany, Italy and Bulgaria, in 1941. The occupying country's policy was to plunder produce from the Greeks to feed the troops, and as a result of this and the fact that wartime disruption caused a drop in agricultural production and collapse of infrastructure, a deadly famine broke out in Greece. The winter of 1941 to 42 was a period of mass starvation, and in total around 300,000 people were killed by the famine. The Allied blockade worsened the situation as it prevented provisions from reaching the civilians. Many people in Oxford were deeply concerned about the humanitarian disaster in Greece and felt they had to do something. In October 1942, Dick Milford, who was then vicar of St Mary's University Church, called a meeting in the old library to discuss what could be done to help, and the Oxford Committee for Famine Relief, which in 1965 was renamed Oxfam, was born. The minute book shown here, a simple school exercise book, is kept in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. The Oxford Committee's original charter stated that its aim was the relief of famine and sickness arising as a result of the war, and the charity's registered address was 12 Holywell Street, Oxford, which was Dick Milford's family home and the house where my mother and her 3 sisters grew up. I'm now going to introduce you to the 3 principal founding members of Oxfam. Canon Dick Milford, as mentioned, was Oxfam's first chairman between 1942 and 47, and he returned to the role in 1960 to 65. He was an enlightened clergyman who'd studied classical literature and philosophy at Oxford and had lived in India where he taught and was ordained. Later, he went on to become Canon and Chancellor of Lincoln Cathedral and Master of the Temple in London, a unique role that is appointed directly by the Crown and based in the Inner and Middle Temple Inns of Court. In 1960, he was one of the witnesses in the famous trial of Lady Chatterley's lover. This was the public prosecution of Penguin by the Crown for the proposed publication of the unexpurgated version of D.H. Lawrence's 1928 novel that was considered obscene. A liberal who believed in freedom of expression, Canon Milford defended the publication of the book, saying he did not think it indecent. Given the case was Penguin versus the Crown, and that the Crown was his employer, this did not go down well with some members of the establishment, including his more conservative colleagues who lived and worked in the Temple Courts and Chambers. Another eminent founder was Australian-born Gilbert Murray, who became honorary trustee. He was Professor of Greek at Oxford University, a lifelong supporter of the Liberal Party, Vice President of the League of Nations Society, and President of the Ethical Union, which has since become Humanists UK. Cecil Jackson Cole was the Oxford Committee's first honorary secretary and was the practical one, business acumen. A Quaker-inspired entrepreneur, in 1945 he set up Andrews Estate Agents as a business purely to fund his charitable initiatives. His service to Oxfam was invaluable. His business bankrolled campaigns, and he paid for advertising and seconded his staff, many of whom were Quakers, to work for the charity. Canon Milford said that Cecil Jackson Cole was the driving force behind Oxfam, with a vision that went way beyond what they were doing at the time. As well as being co-founder of Oxfam, Jackson Cole founded Help the Aged, which later became Age UK, the Anchor Housing Trust and ActionAid. Today, the Andrews Charitable Trust he set up is still Andrews Estate Agents' largest shareholder. Although the 2 principal founders of the Oxford Committee were Christians, it could never be described as a religious organisation as such. Instead, it was founded on the principles established by Quaker relief work in the 19th century, namely that relief should be given according to humanitarian need without regard for a religion, nationality, or side in a conflict. One of the first things the Oxford Committee did was to petition Prime Minister Churchill to lift the Allied blockade so that vital relief for civilians could get through. Initially, they were suggesting sending milk and vitamins to Greek children, but this was flatly refused, as it was officially the responsibility of the occupying forces to care for civilians. Meanwhile, the Oxford Committee launched Greek Week in Oxford, a concentrated fundraising effort which included a gift shop in the city market. In just 1 week, the committee raised £10,700 for the Greek Red Cross, which is more than £385,000 in current money, which is an incredible effort from one city in wartime Britain that was going through its own hardships and rationing. By 1943, the Red Cross had established a way into Greece via neutral Turkey, and wheat and other foodstuffs did get through to some areas. When the war ended in 1945, Europe was in a state of utter devastation, and famine was rife, particularly in Germany. The UN Relief and Rehabilitation Administration had stated that basic food allowance should be 2,600 calories per day, but in the British zone in Germany, rations had been reduced to just over 1,000 calories. In 1945, the publisher Victor Gollancz, a British Jew, set up the Save Europe Now campaign to persuade the UK government to let British people send food parcels to Germany. The Oxford Committee got behind this campaign, despite it potentially being unpopular with the public due to a hostile mood and lack of sympathy with the Germans. The idea was that the people should be allowed to voluntarily give up part of their ration, and that the government would send an equivalent amount of food to relieve starvation in Germany. The proposal was rejected, but the Save Europe campaign went ahead and raised £56,000, which is almost £2 million in today's money. The funds were then channelled through various organisations, including the Quaker Friends Relief Service, who were allowed to carry out humanitarian work in Germany. A large part of Oxfam's work has always been to educate and mobilise the public through its innovative use of advertising. In 1947, the Oxford Committee started placing ads funded by Jackson Cole's business. In 1947, the Oxford Committee opened its first permanent shop at 17 Broad Street, Oxford, where it has continued to trade ever since. It was managed by a salesman called Joe Mitty, an employee of Jackson Cole, who went on to set up more and more shops nationwide. By 1971, the Oxfam shops were making over £1 million a year and had become the largest charity shop chain in the country. Oxfam soon became a household name and generic name for charity shops and everything that they stand for. In 1948, the Marshall Plan was implemented. This was a US initiative to provide economic assistance to Europe after the Second World War. Many other famine relief organisations stepped down after the Marshall Plan got underway, considering themselves redundant. However, the Oxford Committee made the decision not only to continue, but to expand, extending its pledge to relieve suffering as a result of wars or other causes in any part of the world. The campaigning work of the Oxford Committee and other famine relief organisations during and after the war helped pave the way for the Fourth Geneva Convention in 1949, which is adopted to safeguard the protection of all civilians in wartime, including those in occupied territory. Now that the war in Europe was over, Oxfam extended its geographic focus. In 1951, Leslie Kirkley became the General Secretary of Oxfam, and in his 24-year tenure he transformed the organisation from a local charity into an international, multi-million-pound development and relief agency. Like many people involved with Oxfam, Kirkley was a Quaker. When famine hit Bihar in India in 1951, the Oxford Committee responded for the first time to an emergency in a developing country. Within the next 7 years, they were providing emergency support to Asia, Africa, and South America. During the 1960s, Oxfam began to highlight the need for long-term development work to address the causes of poverty. It played a leading role in the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organisation's Freedom from Hunger campaign, launched in the UK in 1962, which focused on providing training and tools for people to grow their own food rather than on giving food aid. The 1960s was also the time when Oxfam became directly involved in the relief effort themselves, rather than just fundraising and sending aid. In 1961, The organisation sent out its first field director to Southern Africa to coordinate its relief and development spending with local relief operations. The group's first direct relief action was in India in 1966, when they sent out a team of volunteers in response to a major famine. Today, we're all familiar with Oxfam's celebrity supporters and ambassadors, but the link up with celebrities is nothing new for the charity. Very early on, the Oxford Committee had a good sense of marketing and promotion and recognised how famous faces could help to raise the organisation's profile around the world. Over 60 years ago, in 1963, when the Beatles had hit the big time, the band joined Oxfam in promoting their £1 million hunger campaign. Further fundraising continued into the 1970s, when a successful mail order operation was implemented. The 1980s was also a very profitable time, helped by highly publicised events like Band Aid and Comic Relief. 1986 was a landmark moment when Oxfam decided to focus more money and attention on women's development, which is something that they've been concentrating on ever since. A year later, they opened their first bookshop in Oxford. Today, Oxfam is the biggest chain selling second-hand books in Europe. By 1990, Oxfam had an annual income of £62 million and was working on projects in over 70 countries. In 1992, in its 50th anniversary year, Oxfam was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in recognition for their work in fighting poverty worldwide. Canon Milford lived until 1987, so lived to see almost all the developments that I've described. In 1981, at the age of 84 and the last surviving founder of Oxfam, he was interviewed about the early days of Oxfam and his hopes for the future, which strike me as being forward-thinking, bearing in mind it was filmed 42 years ago. I'll play an edited version to you now.
Well, here we are. This is the room where it all began.
Yes, this is the old library, and believe it or not, it's the original university library which had all its books in the start. It's not a bad place to think about small beginnings when you compare it with the present Bodleian.
A very suitable place for Oxfam to start.
Yes.
What did the committee really feel that it could achieve at that time?
Well, we really didn't know whether we could achieve anything, but we intended to do our best. First, to put pressure on the government if we could, to ease the suffering in Europe and the starvation, and secondly, to do what we could by raising money for this cause.
What are your most vivid memories of those early days, of the events that happened after the meeting here in the old library?
The great meetings and so on which Jackson Cole remembers organising, I've quite forgotten. But what I do remember is our expedition to present a petition to the Ministry of Economic Warfare. We had more than 3,000 people signing this petition in Oxford, and Member of Parliament, Quintin Hogg, was sufficiently impressed by that to introduce us to the Minister of Economic Warfare. And I remember quite clearly in some building in London, I don't know where, rolling out these masses of paper on the floor and saying, we must do something about Greece. And they gave us what we felt at that time was a very dusty answer. If we help to feed the starving people of Greece, the Germans won't have to do it, and that'll help the Germans with the war. And so we can't do it. We believe, as a matter of fact, in a quiet way, a certain amount of help did get through to Greece, and we hope that our effort contributed to that.
Paused, when you got that answer, quite a long campaign, I believe, to try and get government to change its attitude.
The detail of that I've quite forgotten. But we did go on collecting money, and eventually, when ways opened, particularly after the continent began to be open to ourselves, then we began to get relief on quite a big scale, and this is where it all started. The original charter for the committee was to relief of suffering due to the war, and then we extended it at a later stage to involve suffering of other causes as well. But it all started as relief of suffering due to the war.
I remember in the original minute book, which I've seen, the old school exercise book, that in 1945 the committee debated the problem of whether or not help should be given to ordinary civilians in Germany, German people. Was that a big issue at the time?
45, yes it was. No, I don't think we didn't differ seriously about that. The question was put up because of public relations. Some people thought it would be dangerous. But I don't think we really had any hesitation within our consciences and minds as far as I remember. And the great example of that was Victor Gollancz, who had a special campaign, Save Germany Now. And if a Jew could do that, after what the Jews had suffered at the hands of the Nazis, it wasn't for us to do less. No, I don't think we had any crisis of conscience over that at all.
It surprises many people to hear that one of the very first acts of the original committee was in fact a political one. And the debate, of course, continues as to how far Oxfam should or should not, amongst other things, be politically motivated. Where do you stand in this argument?
Well, in those early days, it never occurred to us to ask any questions about being political. We just did what we had to. We never heard of the charity commissioners, nor of their rules that said the charities were not allowed to take part in politics. We just did what we had to. And it seems to me that the rules of the first Queen Elizabeth about this are very illogical and difficult to apply. After all, amnesty, if that is not a charity, what is a charity? But I believe that amnesty cannot register as a charity because it engages in political action. As far as Oxfam is concerned, I've always felt that if we needed to approach a government in order to make possible our proper work, this was legitimate and we ought to do it, whether members of Parliament or how else. But some of the affiliated bodies have thought that their main job is to agitate politically, especially in foreign countries, to alter their forms of government which are unjust. This, I think, would be quite off our line and is not what we were commissioned to do. There may be a place for bodies to do that, but it's not Oxfam's body. That's what I feel about it, and it's a very difficult line to draw.
It could be argued that in the last 20 years or so, a certain cynicism has coloured the opinions and hopes of many people in the United Kingdom, particularly in our relationships with poor communities in Africa and Asia and Latin America. Have you detected that increasing cynicism? And if so, does it contrast vividly with the mood of people in the 1940s and 50s when Oxfam was young? And at the personal level, what is your own feeling? Has your own vision changed, or do you feel you've remained constant through all these particular problems and difficult years?
A lot of questions wrapped up into that. I don't myself detect an increase in cynicism. I think I detect a diminution of the sense that we are the people who have, and it's our duty to do things for the people who have not, that we are not so well aware of being the privileged as perhaps we were. But I think there's a great increase in the sense of belonging to one world, which is very important. I think in the old days, we thought of ourselves as doing things from here for people who were less well off, but we didn't see, to the extent that we do now, that we are all in the same boat together, and that we have to work together. I think the vision of one world, the pictures of this spaceship Earth phrase, I think Adlai Stevenson may have started that, but the pictures you see of the Earth floating and our common responsibility for this spaceship, this has very much increased, both among young and old. And this, I think, is a very healthy change. It is no longer do-gooders doing good to the be done good to, but it's all together, if we're going to save and survive at all, working together. And this, I think, is what the Brandt report is saying, that the world must work together. And if that vision can get across, it'll be a great improvement on the old vision of the good and bad, of the privileged and the unprivileged. But I don't believe that the young people are any more selfish or disillusioned than we were.
What about you yourself? Do you feel your vision, your understanding has deepened or widened, or where do you feel you now stand in comparison with 1940 or 1950?
Well, the great thing that has come real to me since then, partly through living in the country, partly through having some neighbours who are intensely keen about ecology and very well aware of what we are doing to the earth, raping the earth and wasting its resources at the most desperate speed, and the doom that is hanging over us if we don't change our ways. This is a new line of thought which came to me after we lived in Oxford. I don't say I never thought of it, but it's much more real since living in the country, and we have a prophet who lives near us. And I'm glad that Oxfam is becoming more aware, I think, of this ecological aspect of things. We used to be happy to send tractors and so on to the developing world. I think we're more inclined to give bullocks and so on now and work with the people. And as long term, I'm very glad that we are backing the vegetable seed bank, which is intended to keep a stock of wild seeds for revivification of the vegetable seeds, which are inclined to get worked out through specialization and hybridization. And this is a very long-term thing which may produce results in 20 or 30 years' time, but it's very long-term and visionary effort, but I believe very well worthwhile, for we are all in this thing together, and we've got to work with the earth and not against it.
If you had one simple message that you felt you wanted to leave with Oxfam supporters and volunteers and staff members for the last years of this century, what is it you'd say to them?
I think I should say that hitherto the history of Oxfam seems to show that growth is natural, that it comes by responding to a known demand or a known need which is brought to your attention, and if you respond as best you can to that, you will be shown what steps you must take, whether it's opening shops, whether it's opening a new department, whether it's immediate famine relief, or whether it's long-term agricultural improvement, or whether it's social work. The need comes first and you respond to the need. I don't think you can make a long-term program in advance, and the future is so dicey, nobody knows which way it will go. I think we realize now we are all in one world and we've got to work together. And I shouldn't be at all surprised if in future we find ourselves more and more working with the people from overseas in the developing world, and even having their representatives in our councils. For at present it is we deciding things which we are going to do for them. More and more I think we shall find that it must be a partnership of all together in this one spaceship Earth to which we all belong. And
you feel that Oxfam has the vision to be able to change in this way?
Oxfam hitherto has managed to change and to see each need as it comes along, and it has adapted itself. And as it got bigger and bigger, I'm sometimes afraid that the machine would take over and the heart would go out. But I still feel, whenever I come to the council, not very often now, that the spirit is still there, that people are there because they want to be and are caring, because they're that sort of people. And I hope and I believe that it's going to be the case always, and that the machine is not going to find itself going on and the interest of the staff taking precedence of the purpose for it all. I don't believe this is going to happen. It hasn't happened yet.
Canon
I
Milford,
don't believe it ever will.
Canon Milford, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you.
My grandfather was always very modest about the part he played in Oxfam, claiming his main role was to make it possible for people to work together, which was particularly important as the organisation expanded and differing views came into the mix. He maintained his association with Oxfam to the end of his life and was very proud of what it had achieved. Still with its headquarters in Oxford, Oxfam has continued to grow. In 2022, it received a total income of £373 million, 90 million of which was raised through its 500 plus shops, and it supported 8 million people in 87 different countries. Today, it continues to keep up the vital, life-changing work that started in the old university library over 80 years ago. That's the end of my talk, and thank you very much for your attention.